Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Recently, I've been writing about the crisis of masculinity and how us men can try to solve this crisis. So, what is the crisis, first of all? And I think one of the big issues is that for a very long time, men have defined themselves in a way in terms of women. So, men have basically been like the canon fodder for women, in that the role of men has basically been to serve women and children, to serve and protect society, etc. And while that's all fine and dandy, there's nothing wrong essentially with that. We've reached the point in our civilization where men are not um, being recognized for their contributions, for what they do to the world. And the reason is because the focus is not on that at all. Rather, it is on um, having women become more involved in doing some of what men have always been doing, basically. And since that is the focus, a lot of what men still do and continue to do is basically ignored, right? It's just goes unnoticed, and so men suffer a great deal of not being appreciated as men, and their sentiments are overlooked, and masculinity in itself is often defined as being wrong, being toxic, being, you know, and so men don't very often, increasingly they don't know where to place themselves, how to be, what does it mean, what does masculinity even mean. So I'll read from a book that I've written, where I try to define uh, the crisis of masculinity. How often haven't you heard that a real man is chivalrous? He opens doors and carries bags specifically for women and gives up his seat on the bus. I bet that many of you under the age of 20 can't much identify with the generation I came from. In the 90s, men were rated according to how useful they are to women, children, and society. Is that really the case? Is that what masculinity is all about? It was the early hours of the morning on April the 15th, 1912, when the Titanic sank. There was not enough lifeboats for all the passengers on board. I imagine that if I were in that situation, I would not get on any of the lifeboats. I couldn't do it. I couldn't put the safety of myself ahead of others. I especially couldn't put myself ahead of women and children. That's not only how I feel, that's how many of the men felt on the Titanic. Women gracefully accepted the right for them to survive over that of the men. Naturally, it was the right thing to do. Those are the laws of the sea. At that point, no one would be talking about equality. The truth is, in times of crisis, men are cannon fodder and have always been. Men are defined in terms of women because women are more crucial to the survival of the species. Millions of years of evolution can't be undone with the flip of a postmodern switch. If the species depended on who survived on the Titanic, it would be necessary for more women to survive than men. Technically, one very happy man can impregnate hundreds of women, but one woman can only conceive of a certain limited number of children. Men die protecting women because by doing so they are protecting the human race. It's purely instinct and heroic at the same time. It sounds a bit bleak, right? There's another side to the masculinity in relation to how women are viewed. On the one hand, instinctively men want to protect women. On the other hand, men want to own them. Nature does not burden men with an innate responsibility without also giving them a reward. Men have always laid claim to some woman who owed them their loyalty. This ownership, as it were, was also a survival instinct. Namely, women give birth to children and men have a sense of parental investment. Men are not going to be invested in children that are not biologically theirs. Instinctively, most men would demand exclusive right to women they are sleeping with. It becomes a type of ownership of the woman's sexuality. Men then go on to guard their mates against other predator males who might also try to mate with their woman. So far, nothing about men has been defined in and of himself. That's because it isn't possible. You came into the world through a vagina and you practically run around most of your life trying to get into a vagina. There's no getting away from it. So instead, I call on all brothers, I call on you men, to own it. Men are defined in terms of women, but also men helped to define women and how they behave. The fact is that while many women would have survived the Titanic, they would go on to be some man's woman. They would go on to be someone's mother, someone's sister, someone's aunt, someone's daughter, and someone's wife. Human relations in general cannot be separated from gender relations. A man with lots of women is often seen as a legend. It was almost acceptable that Elvis Presley or Winston Churchill womanized. Some men boast that they've had hundreds of women and hundreds more women go on to sleep with them. Women have lots of male partners are generally called sluts. They say that a key that opens all locks is a master key, but a lock that can be opened by any key is called a broken lock. Men are defined in terms of women, and women are also defined in terms of men. It was, after all, one organism that split, and ever since, the parts of this organism sought to be joined together. The crisis we face as men is that we have instincts that have existed and been developed over millions of years. For the first time in human history, we are asked to ignore these instincts so as to allow women to compete in the male arena. We should not sexualize women, yet we are biologically designed to do so. We should not seek to protect them because then we might restrict their freedoms or take away some of their autonomy. We should not expect their chastity because then we are curtailing their right to sleep around. After we've been told that we have no right over women whatsoever, we are still expected to give up the lifeboats for them. We are expected to go to war in protection of them. We are called on in times of difficulty to be men. In times of ease, we are asked to be pussies. The crisis of masculinity is that the postmodern society has asked of us to have no integrity, to break up what constitutes our very being, so that we are broken and disjointed only to be punished for not holding our own or bringing home the bacon. The crisis of masculinity is that men are being asked not to be men most of the time, and to be men some of the time. Men are to be men when they must risk their lives to protect and serve society, women and children. Men should not be men when, in trying to protect and serve, they ask their woman to obey them. A man may not ask his woman not to engage in relations with other men that he deeply mistrusts or because he finds a sexual undertone to the relationship. He may not prefer to marry a virgin. He may not prefer to marry a virgin as opposed to a woman who isn't. He may not ask a woman to do anything for him whatsoever. That part of masculinity must be abandoned because the femininity we encourage requires no obligations or responsibilities towards anyone, especially not a man. What men ought to do is own the full spectrum of who they are and what they are, and demand that they get what they believe they deserve from women and society. If it is upon men to protect and serve society, then it is also upon the society, women and children, to facilitate this obligation by being cooperative. It is not possible to have parental investment in children if the father has no right or say over what should happen in their lives. It is not possible to have true instincts towards women as sexual partners if the man cannot have a say in what happens in their lives. Inasmuch as a man has no real autonomy when he spends his entire life working for a family, so too do women not have real autonomy when they spend their entire lives working with their mates to raise a family. Western society has turned to shit because it underscored its civilization on individual autonomy without considering the needs of a collectivist species. We have never in human history survived on our own. We have only ever survived as part of a collective, the smallest unit of which has been to pair bond in monogamous and polygynous unions. When Western society broke away from the extended family and had the nuclear family as its center, it started on a downhill spiral. It broke away the very real social fabric and connections that people needed in order to live full and healthy lives. Later on, this resulted in the breakaway of the nuclear family itself. Sure, individuals have greater autonomy when by themselves. Yes, you could be a man by yourself living your life without meaningful connections. You could be a woman that cycles through 20 or 30 guys because long-term relationships don't exist in your vocabulary. Let me ask you this. Are you happy? Does the freedom to sleep around with whoever you want, whenever you want, make you happy? Thank you very much. We will look at the next section at another stage.